Welcome back. Today, we're breaking down the complete Hollow Knight and Silksong timeline, from beginning to end. If you enjoy this kind of content, don't forget to like the video and subscribe. Let's begin. In the beginning, there existed only darkness, and the void a living absence, a force of nothingness that hungered and writhed beneath the world. Within this primordial shadow dwelled creatures of pure emptiness, beings without thought or purpose, merely existing in the endless dark. Above this abyss stretched an ancient kingdom of worms, great pale serpents of immense power and intelligence. These worms possessed prescience and ambition, each capable of transforming reality itself. Among them wandered one worm who would change everything, a pale creature who gazed upon the mindless bugs of the surface world and saw not primitives, but potential. This pale worm made a choice that would echo through eternity. He shed his massive serpentine form, a molt of cosmic proportions that would later become a landmark in the kingdom he would build. From this transformation emerged a new being, smaller, refined, taking the shape of the very bugs he sought to elevate. He became the Pale King, and with his transformation came a gift that would doom and define his legacy, the power to grant sapience itself. The Pale King established his kingdom in a vast cavern system, building a civilization of unprecedented grandeur. With his queen, a being known as the White Lady, a root goddess of immense age and power, he began to spread his influence. The king's light touched the minds of bugs, awakening them from their primal existence. Suddenly, creatures who had lived by pure instinct found themselves capable of thought, emotion, dreams, and ambition. Hallownest grew magnificent. Great towers rose in the City of Tears, where eternal rain fell as if the stones themselves wept with beauty. The crystal peak gleamed with luminescent minerals, mined by awakened bugs who now understood purpose and craft. Greenpath flourished with cultivated nature, and Deepnest, though remaining wild and hostile, became known rather than merely feared. The Pale King ruled with calculated precision from his palace, the White Palace, a structure of impossible geometry and gleaming white spires. He surrounded himself with loyal servants, the 5 great knights who embodied martial perfection, the Watchers who served as spies and scholars, and countless citizens who worshipped him as their divine creator. The queen remained in her gardens, a figure of gentle authority who bore the king's heirs and watched over the kingdom's natural growth. But the king's gift came with an unforeseen price. Deep within the kingdom, forgotten and sealed, dwelled the Radiance, an ancient god of light who had ruled the bugs before the Pale King's arrival. When the pale worm granted sapience and his own pale light to the bugs, they forgot their old god. The moths, who had once been the Radiance's devoted tribe, turned away from her dreamlight to serve the new king. This abandonment wounded the Radiance deeply, and from that wound grew a terrible vengeance. The Radiance began to push through the barriers of dream and waking. Her light, once benevolent, became aggressive and invasive. It infected the minds of bugs as a disease, filling their thoughts with her burning presence until individuality dissolved into a unified, screaming radiance. The infected bugs' eyes blazed orange with her light, and from their bodies leaked a virulent substance that spread the infection further. The afflicted lost themselves entirely. Some became shambling husks, walking corpses animated by the Radiance's will. Others transformed into violent creatures, attacking anything uninfected with mindless fury. The kingdom that the Pale King had built on the foundation of thought and choice began to crumble as minds were enslaved to a light more ancient than his own. The Pale King, with all his prescience and power, recognized the existential threat. He understood that the Radiance could not be destroyed through conventional means. She existed as an idea, as a memory, as a god within the dream realm itself. To truly defeat her, he would need a vessel capable of containing her utterly, a prison that could hold a god without breaking. The Pale King conceived of a solution terrible in its logic. He required a being strong enough to contain the Radiance, yet utterly hollow, possessing no mind to corrupt, no will to break, no voice to cry suffering. Only perfect emptiness could imprison absolute light. The king turned his gaze downward, to the abyss beneath his kingdom, to the void that had existed before all things. With the White Lady, he created thousands upon thousands of offspring, then cast them into that primordial darkness. The void would claim most of them, and those it touched would be transformed, becoming vessels of living darkness, children of both God and emptiness. The abyss became a testing ground of cosmic cruelty. The children climbed desperately toward the light above, seeking their father's approval, but most fell back into the dark. The Pale King waited and watched, seeking one perfectly hollow child, one without any flaw of thought or feeling that the Radiance might exploit. The White Lady remained in her gardens, grief-bound by her complicity in this necessary atrocity. She had birthed these children knowing their purpose, knowing most would die in the abyss, knowing that even success meant eternal imprisonment for the chosen one. From the countless fallen emerged one small figure who climbed successfully from the abyss. The Pale King examined this child and deemed it acceptable, hollow enough to serve. This vessel was brought to the palace, trained by the great knights, and prepared for its ultimate purpose. The kingdom called it the Hollow Knight, though it was called nothing by the king, for names implied identity, and identity implied the mind they sought to deny. But the king's perception, for all his prescience, contained a fatal blindness. He saw what he needed to see in the small vessel before him, not what truly existed. When the Hollow Knight reached maturity, the ritual was prepared. The vessel would be sealed in the temple of the Black Egg, bound by great chains and held by the power of 3 dreamers' bugs who would sacrifice their waking lives to maintain the seal through eternal sleep. These dreamers were Hera the Beast, Queen of Deepnest, who demanded an heir as payment for her service, Lorien the Watcher, the king's most devoted follower, and Manamon the Teacher, a scholar who understood the necessity despite her doubts. The Radiance was confronted in the dream realm and drawn into the Hollow Knight. The vessel was chained within the Black Egg, the dreamers fell into their slumber, and the seal was completed. The infection receded like a tide pulling back from the shore. Hallownest was saved. The Pale King retreated to his white palace, believing his kingdom preserved. But he had created his salvation from a foundation of flawed assumptions, and cracks had already begun to form in his perfect plan. The Hollow Knight was not hollow. Time passed, and the king realized his mistake too late. The vessel had developed what he had sought to prevent: a connection, an attachment, specifically to him. The child had looked up at its father and felt something, some small seed of emotion or thought, and that single imperfection became the gap through which the Radiance could work. Inside its prison, the Hollow Knight began to break. The Radiance pushed against the boundaries of the vessel's mind, exploiting that one flaw, widening it like water, freezing in stone until cracks spread throughout the whole structure. The vessel held it had been designed to hold, trained to hold, and it held even as it broke, but perfection had been compromised. The Pale King, facing the failure of his grand design, took desperate action. He retreated to his white palace with his most trusted servants and performed a great working of soul and magic. The entire palace was cast into the dream realm, removed from reality itself, perhaps to hide the shame of failure, perhaps to preserve something for an uncertain future. When the palace vanished, the king vanished with it. Whether he died, whether he sleeps, whether he waits in some pocket of dream reality for a second chance, none can say with certainty. He left behind only his corpse upon his throne in the dream palace, suggesting death, though death for a god remains ambiguous. The White Lady sealed herself within her gardens, in the queen's gardens, binding herself with roots and vines. She would wait, preserved in living stasis, unable or unwilling to act further. The kingdom her partner had built would face its fate without its gods. Without the king's presence, without his light to guide and order, Hallownest began its long decline. The infection, though contained, began to seep back into the kingdom as the Hollow Knight's prison slowly failed. The return came gradually at first, a few bugs here and there showing orange eyes and erratic behavior, easily isolated or destroyed. But containment could not last. The infection spread with increasing speed as the decades passed, and the Hollow Knights will eroded under the Radiance's relentless assault. The citizens of Hallownest fell one by one, their minds consumed by hostile light. The City of Tears became a city of the dead and infected, its citizens shambling through rain-slick streets they no longer recognized. The kingdom's defenders fought a losing battle. The great knights scattered or fell. Ogrim, the dung defender, remained at his post in the waterways, faithful beyond reason to a kingdom already dead. Isma was lost. Zamer departed to grieve. The pale lurker vanished. Hegemal fell to the mantis thieves who stole his armor. The mantis tribe in the fungal wastes held their territory against the infection through martial discipline and ruthless culling of the infected. They maintained their honor and their borders even as everything around them collapsed. Deepness remained hostile and independent as it had always been. Its spiders and weavers either resistant to or isolated from the infection spread. The City of Tears fell silent except for the rain and the moans of the infected. The Crystal Peaks miners either fled or transformed into crystallized, infected husks. Greenpath's gardens grew wild and choked with infected plant life. The archives in Fog Canyon were abandoned, its jellies floating mindlessly through the mist. The three dreamers maintained their sleep, holding the seal on the black egg even as the kingdom around them died. They could not wake without breaking the seal, and breaking the seal would release the radiance entirely. So they slept while Hallownest became a tomb. From beyond Hallownest's borders, from the wasteland outside, came a small figure. Another vessel, another child of the Pale King and the Abyss. One who had failed the climb and been left behind when the Hollow Knight was chosen. This little ghost had somehow escaped the kingdom entirely, wandering the barren lands beyond until some unknown force drew it back. The ghost descended into the ruins of Hallownest without memory, without voice, without clear purpose. It carried only a simple nail and an instinct to move forward. The old stag station keeper barely remembered his purpose, but allowed the ghost to travel the ancient underground transit system. In the ruins, the ghost found survivors. Elderbug in Dirtmouth, the last bug in a dying village. Cornifer, a cartographer, mapping a kingdom of ghosts. Quirrell, a wanderer, seeking answers about his own forgotten past. The ghost grew stronger as it explored. It defeated infected creatures and absorbed their essence, their geo, their strength. It learned combat techniques from the souls of fallen warriors. It acquired charms, tokens of power left behind by the dead and dying, each one a story of someone who had tried to survive or fight or simply endure. In Greenpath, the ghost encountered Hornet, a mysterious figure who tested it with combat. She spoke of proving its strength, of secrets the ghost could not yet understand. Hornet was the daughter of Hera the Beast and the Pale King, the price Hera had demanded for becoming a dreamer, and she watched the ghost with intense scrutiny, seeking to understand what this vessel intended. The ghost delved deeper. It found the remains of the kingdom's glory in the City of Tears, where Quirrell stood before the blue lake, contemplating memories that surfaced like ghosts of thought. It discovered the ancient battlegrounds where the kingdom's warriors had fought the infection. It descended into the abyss itself, confronting the darkness from which it had been born. Gradually, the ghost came to understand its nature and its purpose through fragments and implications rather than direct knowledge. It gathered the abilities necessary to challenge the dreamers and acquired the Dream Nail, an ancient weapon capable of cutting through the barrier between waking and dream. The ghost faced a choice that rippled with possibility. It could defeat the three dreamers, breaking the seal on the black egg and confronting the Hollow Knight directly. In doing so, it might take the Hollow Knight's place, becoming the new vessel to contain the radiance, sacrificing itself to extend Hallownest's dying dream a little longer. Or it could go further, by finding the Void Heart, by fully embracing its nature as a being of the void and achieving unity with that primordial darkness. The ghost could become something the Pale King had never intended, not a hollow vessel, but a vessel with identity, with purpose, with the power to truly challenge the radiance rather than merely contain her. Some ghosts chose sacrifice, taking the Hollow Knight's place in an ending that changed nothing fundamental. The infection would eventually return as the new vessel inevitably developed the flaws that Hallownest was meant to prevent. Some ghosts, guided by Hornet, who revealed her purpose as both observer and protector, went deeper. They gathered the fragments of the king's kingdom, the king's soul, split between the pale king's corpse and the white lady's sanctuary. United, the king's soul transformed in the abyss into the void heart, a charm representing the ghost's acceptance of its true nature. With the void heart, the ghost could enter the dream within the Hollow Knight's mind and confront the radiance directly in her realm of absolute light. This battle occurred in a space beyond physical reality, where thought and dream were the only substance. The radiance fought with desperate fury, understanding perhaps that this small shadow represented something she had not anticipated. The ghost had been made to contain her, but it had become something else, a void given purpose, emptiness with determination, darkness that chose to act rather than merely exist. When the ghost wounded the radiance sufficiently, something unprecedented occurred. The siblings that had fallen into the abyss, the thousands of vessels who had died in that primordial dark, responded to the ghost's achievement. They rose from the void as a tide of darkness, shadows given momentary form and singular purpose. The void consumed the radiance completely. The god of light was dragged into absolute darkness, not contained but truly destroyed, erased from existence by the very emptiness the pale king had sought to exploit. In destroying her, the void also destroyed the ghost, the Hollow Knight, and potentially itself as a conscious force. The aftermath. In Dirtmouth, Hornet waited. The infection faded from Hallownest like a nightmare on waking. The orange light left the eyes of the infected, and those who could recover, recovered. Those too far gone simply died, their bodies finally allowed to rest. The kingdom remained dead in the sense that its glory and civilization could never be restored. Too much had been lost, too many had died, the king and queen had abandoned or sealed themselves away. But it was no longer actively dying. The survivors could rebuild something new, something smaller perhaps, but something free from the cycle of godlight and infection that had defined Hallownest's rise and fall. Hornet remained as the kingdom's protector, the last child of the Pale King still capable of action. Elderbug and the other survivors could descend into the ruins to reclaim what they wished. The Mantis tribe could lower their guard slightly. Deepness would remain deepness, hostile and independent as it preferred. The ghost sacrifice, if sacrifice it was, had broken the cycle. The Pale King's solution had been to imprison one god with a hollow vessel, a temporary measure that merely delayed the inevitable. The ghost's solution, inadvertent or intentional, had been permanent. No more infection, no more radiance, no more need for hollow vessels or dreamers or seals. Yet the cost remained almost incomprehensible. The Pale King had sacrificed thousands of his children to create one vessel. That vessel had failed. The ghost had succeeded, but in doing so had potentially destroyed itself, its sibling, and called upon all the dead vessels to achieve that success. The foundation of Hallownest's salvation was built on countless small corpses in an abyss of darkness. The tale of Hallownest stands as a chronicle of ambition and consequence, of gods who sought to elevate or dominate, of kings who believed their wisdom sufficient to solve any problem, of sacrifices made by those who had no choice in their making. The Pale King's great work, granting sapience to mindless bugs, had been genuinely wondrous. He had created thought, art, civilization, meaning where none had existed. But he had also created the conditions for the Radiance's return, had responded to that return with calculated cruelty, and had ultimately failed despite his prescience and power. The Radiance's vengeance, however understandable her initial abandonment, had consumed the very bugs she sought to reclaim. In trying to force them to remember and worship her, she had destroyed their minds entirely, reducing them to less than they had been even before the Pale King's intervention. The Hollow Knight's tragedy was perhaps the deepest, a being created to be nothing, who became something just enough to fail its purpose, who held its prison for untold years while slowly breaking apart from within, unable to express its suffering due to the very hollowness that was meant to make it immune to suffering. And the ghost, the little shadow that saved the kingdom, remained ultimately unknowable. Whether it acted from heroism, instinct, curiosity, or some purpose beyond comprehension, its actions freed Hallownest from the cycle of infection and containment. The kingdom of Hallownest fell silent in the deep places of the earth, a monument to divine ambition and its consequences, populated now only by those who survived and those who chose to explore its ruins. The gods were gone, the pale king removed or dead, the white lady sealed away, the radiance destroyed. What remained was for bugs to determine on their own, without the light or guidance or infection of higher powers. In the end, Hallownest's story was one of cost and choice. Every salvation required sacrifice, every solution created new problems, every act of creation or destruction rippled through generations. The little ghost's journey through this dead kingdom ultimately offered the possibility of something the Pale King never achieved, not eternal preservation, but genuine ending and the hope of new beginning. Continue 0639. The threads beyond the kingdom. Yet, Hallownest's story extends beyond the central tragedy of King, Radiance, and Vessels. The kingdom was woven from countless individual threads, each representing lives touched by the grand design and its collapse. Hera the Beast had ruled Deepnest with absolute authority, her people devoted to her strength and cunning. When the Pale King came seeking her cooperation for the sealing, she understood the cost immediately. An eternal sleep, consciousness preserved but life suspended, her mind serving as one lock on the black egg's seal. She bargained ruthlessly. If she must sacrifice her waking life, the king would give her a child, an heir who could rule Deepnest in her absence. The king agreed, and Hornet was born from this political and biological arrangement. Hera knew she would never see her daughter grow, never teach her the ways of Deepnest's shadows and silk. She entered her sleep understanding that her sacrifice preserved not just Hallownest, but Deepnest's future through the child she would never raise. The pain of that choice remained with her through all the years of dreaming, a mother's grief frozen in the moment of separation. Lurien the Watcher had devoted his entire existence to observing and protecting Hallownest. From his spire overlooking the City of Tears, he had watched the kingdom flourish and recorded its growth with meticulous care. His loyalty to the Pale King transcended mere service. It approached worship, a conviction that the king's wisdom was absolute and his kingdom worth any price. When the king called upon him to become a dreamer, Lurien accepted without hesitation or negotiation. He sealed himself in his tower, his last waking sight, the city he loved, preserved forever in the moment before sleep. His butler remained outside the dream, maintaining the tower through decades of decay, faithful to a master who could never acknowledge his service. Lurien's devotion never wavered, even as the city below fell to infection and ruin. In his dreams, perhaps he still saw Hallownest as it was in its glory, untouched by the collapse occurring beyond his sleeping awareness. Monomon the teacher had approached her role differently. A scholar of profound intellect, she had studied the infection, the void, the nature of dreams and soul. She understood the theoretical elegance of the Pale King's plan and recognized its practical necessity. Yet she also perceived its potential flaws with a clarity that troubled her deeply. Monomon recorded her doubts in her archives, leaving behind research notes that questioned whether perfect hollowness could truly exist, whether the seal could hold indefinitely, whether the cost was justifiable. But understanding the danger and lacking better alternatives, she acceded to becoming a dreamer. She prepared her protector, Quirrell, and hid from him the memories of who she was to him, sending him beyond Hallownest's borders to live a life free from the kingdom's doom. Before entering her dream, Monomon left behind instructions for her own destruction. If someone capable enough arose to challenge the seal, if circumstances changed sufficiently that a better solution might exist, she wanted them to have the option of breaking her lock. This was her final act of scholarship, accounting for variables she could not predict, planning for possibilities beyond her own understanding. The five great knights had represented the pinnacle of Hallownest's martial achievement, warriors who served the Pale King with absolute dedication. Their fates illustrated the various ways duty could manifest and fail. Ogrim, called the Dung Defender, had found his calling in the unglamorous work of maintaining the waterways beneath the kingdom. Where others might have considered such service beneath a great knight's dignity, Ogrim embraced it with genuine joy. He saw the beauty in necessary work, the honor in maintaining infrastructure that allowed civilization to function. His strength was immense, his skill formidable, but his true power lay in his unshakable loyalty and his capacity for happiness, even in humble circumstances. When Hallownest fell, Ogrim remained at his post. Decades passed, the kingdom died around him, the other knights vanished or fell, and still Ogrim guarded the waterways. He fought the infected that wandered into his domain, maintained the passages as best he could, and waited for his king to return. His faith never broke, even as evidence of abandonment became overwhelming. In his isolation, surrounded by waste and water, Ogrim exemplified both the nobility and the tragedy of absolute devotion. A knight who served perfectly but could not save what he was sworn to protect. Isma had been devoted to Ogrim, their bond transcending the formal hierarchy of knighthood. She possessed a unique connection to the kingdom's natural essence, a power that allowed her to create the acidic groves that both protected and isolated portions of Hallownest. When she fell, whether to the infection, to some other danger, or to simple grief, her essence transformed into a protective tear, a grove of acid surrounding a flower that preserved her memory. Ogrim mourned her across the ages, speaking of her with tenderness that transcended death. He kept her memory alive through stories told to the infected husks and the darkness, through flowers placed with care in places only he would see. His grief never consumed his duty, but it colored every moment of his endless vigil. Zamer, the Grey Mourner, had come from lands beyond Hallownest, bringing with her techniques and traditions foreign to the kingdom. She had loved another, a traitor to Hallownest, someone who had stood against the Pale King's order. This love had defined and doomed her. When her beloved fell in the conflict between Hallownest and Deepnest, Zamer's heart broke in ways that duty could not repair. She became a mourner in truth, her grief so profound that it transformed her purpose entirely. She ceased to be a knight in practice, though she retained the title. Her only mission became honoring her lost love through pilgrimage and remembrance, bringing flowers to the grave again and again across the years. Each journey a ritual of grief that could never truly end. Dryia had served the White Lady directly, guarding the queen in her gardens. She stood as a shield between the queen and all threats, a protector whose devotion to the White Lady matched Lurien's devotion to the king. When the queen sealed herself away in living stasis, Dryia attempted to continue her protection, but time and circumstance wore even the greatest warriors down. She fell, her body remaining in the queen's gardens as a testament to service rendered until the very end. Hegemal, the mighty pillar among the knights, possessed strength that seemed unassailable. His armor was legendary, a massive construction that made him appear more monument than warrior. Yet strength alone could not preserve him. The Mantis thieves of Deepnest, those who rejected the Mantis tribe's code of honor, struck him down through ambush and cunning. They stole his shell, his armor, using it to disguise one of their own. This theft went deeper than mere equipment. The Mantis who took Hegemal's armor took his identity, walking through Hallownest wearing the appearance of a great knight. The deception perhaps went unnoticed in the kingdom's final days, or perhaps no one remained who cared enough to investigate. Hegemal's fall demonstrated that even the mightiest could be brought down by betrayal, and that in a collapsing kingdom, even such significant deaths might pass unmarked and unmourned. Deepnest represented Hallownest's shadow, the part of the kingdom that had never fully bent to the Pale King's will. The spiders and weavers who dwelt in those dark tunnels had accepted the king's rule in the barest technical sense, maintaining their own culture, their own power structures, their own savage independence. The weavers possessed an ancient art of creating seals through silk and pattern, weaving magic into their work with a skill that predated the Pale King's arrival. Their craft had been employed in the creation of the seals that bound certain powers and places throughout Hallownest. They worked with the king when necessary, but maintained their distance and their secrets. When Hera fell into her dream sleep, Deepnest lost its unifying authority. The weavers, the spiders, the devouts, and the various other creatures of the depths fell into factional chaos. Some areas became completely hostile, attacking anything that entered. Other sections fell to the infection despite the spider's natural resistance. The distant village, where Hera's sleeping body remained protected, became a shrine guarded by infected spiders whose devotion to their queen transcended even the loss of their minds. Midwife, one of Deepnest's strangest inhabitants, survived through adaptability and cunning. She remembered the births of the vessels, having been present when the Pale King and White Lady created their children. She knew secrets of Hallownest's foundation that even most of the kingdom's nobility had never learned. Yet this knowledge brought her no power or security. She remained in Deepnest, speaking in riddles and hints, offering fragments of truth to those rare travelers who survived long enough to find her. The Weaver's seals throughout Hallownest began to fail as the kingdom collapsed. Without maintenance, without the collective will that had created them, the ancient silk bindings frayed and broke. What had been contained began to emerge, adding to the chaos of the infection spread. The Pale King's court had been a structure of elaborate hierarchy and carefully maintained roles. When the king vanished, this structure collapsed with startling rapidity, revealing how entirely it had depended on his presence. The king's molds and wing molds' empty shells, animated by void and bound to the king's will, simply ceased functioning. They stood like statues throughout the palace and the kingdom. Their purpose ended the moment their creator's power withdrew. These constructs had been the king's perfect servants, hollow in truth rather than merely design. And they illustrated what the Hollow Knight was meant to be: empty vessels, filled with directed purpose and nothing more. The Pale Lurker, most mysterious of the great knights, vanished entirely. Some believed she had been an assassin, others a spy. Still others suggested she had been something stranger, perhaps a manifestation of the king's own shadow, perhaps a being from before the kingdom's founding who had served for reasons known only to herself. Whatever her nature, she disappeared when the king did, leaving behind only questions and the faintest traces of her passage. The Soul Sanctum, where the scholars of soul had researched the essence that powered magic and life, devolved into horror. The Soul Master who led these researchers had become obsessed with immortality, driven to desperation by the infection's spread. He began experimenting on living subjects, extracting and concentrating soul through techniques that tortured their victims. The Soul Master believed he could transcend the infection through accumulating enough soul to achieve a higher state of being. His researchers followed him into this madness, conducting experiments of escalating cruelty. When the ghosts arrived, the Soul Sanctum had become a charnel house, filled with the folded remains of bugs drained of their essence, and the infected scholars who continued their work long after any rational purpose had been lost. The Mantis tribe's honor. In the fungal wastes, the Mantis tribe maintained their traditions with rigid discipline. They had accepted the Pale King's rule on their own terms. They would not oppose Hallownest directly, but they would govern their own territory according to their own laws. The Mantises valued combat prowess above all else, measuring worth through dueling, skill, and martial achievement. When Hallownest fell and the infection spread, the Mantis tribe faced it with the same approach they applied to all threats: direct confrontation and absolute intolerance. They culled infected mantises without hesitation or sentiment. They sealed the borders between their territory and Deepnest, preventing the chaos of that region from spilling into theirs. They maintained their culture through sheer force of will and blade. The Mantis Lords, three sisters who ruled the tribe collectively, embodied this philosophy perfectly. They were warriors of sublime skill, moving with a precision and grace that transcended mere technique. When the ghosts challenged them, seeking passage to Deepnest, they tested it without mercy. Only by proving combat capability equal to their standards could the ghost earn their respect and permission to pass. Yet even the Mantis tribe harbored division. The Mantis traitors who had killed Hegemal represented a faction that had abandoned honor for opportunism. These outcasts lurked in the margins of Deepnest, using Mantis techniques for theft and ambush rather than honorable combat. The Mantis Lords considered them beneath contempt, not even worthy of pursuit and punishment, simply erased from consideration as mantises entirely. Beyond Hallownest's borders, and perhaps beyond conventional reality, wandered the Grim Troop, a traveling circus that existed in the spaces between kingdoms and dreams. Led by the Troop Master Grimm, These performers were bound to a ritual cycle of death and rebirth, consuming the nightmares and flames of dying kingdoms to fuel their master's resurrection. The troupe appeared in Dirtmouth, drawn by Hallownest's collapse, by the concentrated essence of fear and flame that had accumulated in the kingdom's dying. Grimm offered the ghost a choice: participate in the nightmare ritual, gathering flames throughout Hallownest to fuel the birth of the Grimm child, or reject the ritual by banishing the troupe entirely. Grimm himself was courteous, almost elegant in his menace. He spoke of the ritual as a dance, a performance that had played out across countless kingdoms and would continue long after Hallownest's story ended. The flames the ghost gathered came from the kingdom's nightmares, made manifest creatures born from fear and suffering that had taken on independent existence in the wake of collapse. If the ghost completed the ritual, the Grimm child would mature and consume Grimm, allowing the troupe master to be reborn and the cycle to continue. If the ghost chose banishment instead, working with the mantis Brum to destroy the troupe's heart, the cycle would be broken and the troupe expelled from Hallownest. Neither choice was entirely good or evil. The ritual was simply the Grimm troupe's nature, a cycle as natural to them as death and rebirth were to any organism. The hive's isolation. Hidden within the kingdom, the hive had maintained its independence through different means than either Deep Nest or the mantis tribe. The bees who dwelt there had accepted the Pale King's gift of higher thought, but had chosen to use that sapience to consciously limit their own individuality. They remained devoted to their queen Vespa, organizing their society around her as their ancestors had done before the king's arrival. The hive's honey production had been valuable to Hallownest, and the bees had been content to trade with the kingdom while maintaining their isolation. When the infection spread, Vespa sealed the hive entirely, forbidding any entrance or exit. The bees would survive the kingdom's fall by removing themselves from it completely. But Vespa eventually died, and her death left the hive without direction. The bees continued their routines, maintaining the structure and producing honey, but without clear purpose. They became increasingly aggressive toward intruders, defending their territory with mindless ferocity. The Hive Knight, Vespa's champion and the strongest warrior of the colony, continued to protect the inner chambers even as the hive society gradually degraded into purposeless repetition. The hive's fate illustrated a gentler form of tragedy than the infection's violence. These bees had not been consumed by hostile light or reduced to shambling husks. They had simply lost their organizing principle, their queen. And without her, they could maintain but not adapt, preserve but not change. They became trapped in amber of their own making, alive but not living. Quirrell's journey. Among all the characters who wandered through Hallownest's ruins, Quirrell represented perhaps the most poignant exploration of memory, purpose, and choice. He had been Monomon's assistant, devoted to the teacher and her research. When Monomon prepared to become a dreamer, she had deliberately obscured Quirrell's memories and sent him beyond Hallownest's borders, giving him a life free from the kingdom's doom. Quirrell wandered distant lands, experiencing adventures and growth unconnected to Hallownest. But something eventually called him back, an instinct, a fragment of purpose that survived even Monomon's careful memory work. He returned to find the kingdom dead or dying, a place he seemed to remember but could not quite place. Throughout the ghost's journey, Quirrell appeared repeatedly in the archives, studying Monomon's research with a scholar's dedication he couldn't explain. At the Pilgrim's Way, contemplating the monuments to the kingdom's glory in the City of Tears, standing before the Blue Lake and experiencing emotions he didn't fully understand. As his memories gradually returned, Quirrell came to understand his purpose. He was meant to help destroy Monomon's seal, to enable the next stage of whatever solution might present itself. He assisted the ghost in reaching the teacher, in breaking her protection, in killing her dreaming form. He fulfilled the purpose Monomon had embedded in him, even as she had tried to give him freedom. After Monomon's death, Quirrell stood beside the Blue Lake in the City of Tears. He spoke of finding peace, of understanding his place in the story, of being ready to rest. He left his nail planted by the lake's shore, a warrior's gesture of ending one's battles. What became of Quirrell after that moment remains ambiguous, but the implication hung heavy. He had completed his purpose, had honored his teacher even in destroying her, and perhaps had chosen his own ending in the quiet waters of the lake. His story spoke to questions of purpose and freedom, whether being given a task by someone you love is slavery or gift, whether completing that task brings liberation or loss, whether a life defined by another's design can still contain genuine meaning. Deep below even the abyss, in spaces that existed between reality and dream, dwelt the God-seekers bugs from a distant land who worshipped strength and power in their purest forms. They had come to Hallownest, drawn by the presence of the Pale King and the other powerful beings that dwelt there. The God-seekers sought to witness and catalog divine combat, to understand the hierarchy of ultimate power. They created the God-seekers Pantheon, a dream realm where the ghost could face the kingdom's mightiest warriors and creatures in successive combat trials. Each pantheon increased in difficulty, culminating in battles against the kingdom's most powerful entities, the Hollow Knight, the Radiance herself, and others of comparable might. The God-seekers' obsession had an almost religious fervor. They believed that by witnessing and documenting ultimate power, they could approach divinity themselves. Their entire culture revolved around this pursuit, reducing all value to combat capability and all meaning to the hierarchy of who could defeat whom. Yet their obsession contained its own danger. In seeking out and worshiping the Radiance through their dream rituals, the God-seekers risked spreading the infection through dimensions beyond Hallownest itself. One ending path saw the Radiance consuming the God-seeker from within, using her as a vector to spread beyond the kingdom's boundaries, forcing the ghost to contain both God and worshipper together in the void. Among all the quests and challenges within Hallownest ruins, one stood apart for its pure fragility. The Grey Mourner tasked the ghost with carrying a delicate flower to her lover's grave in the Queen's Gardens, a flower so fragile that any damage, any combat, any rough movement would destroy it entirely. This quest forced the ghost to traverse Hallownest with perfect care, avoiding all enemies, taking routes that minimized danger, moving with gentleness that contradicted the brutal combat defining most of its journey. The flower represented memory made physical, love persisting beyond death, the idea that even in a kingdom of violence and infection, beauty and devotion still held meaning. Successfully delivering the flower earned no practical reward, no charm, no ability, no power. The value was entirely in the act itself, in honoring a love that had transcended death and divided loyalty, in proving that care and gentleness could still exist in Hallownest's ruins. The flower could also be given to others, to Elderbug, to the God-seeker's grave, to various characters who might appreciate such a gift. Each recipient responded with surprise and gratitude, suggesting that such gestures of beauty had become rare enough to be remarkable. The ghost's journey through Hallownest ultimately led to multiple possible conclusions, each reflecting different understandings of what it meant to resolve the kingdom's crisis. In the simplest ending, the ghost simply replaced the Hollow Knight, taking its place in the Black Egg to contain the Radiance. This was the Pale King's original solution, executed with a new vessel, buying time but solving nothing fundamental. Eventually, this new vessel would fail as the Hollow Knight had failed, and the cycle would continue. With Hornet's intervention, a variation emerged. The ghost could be sealed alongside Hornet herself, her presence adding strength to the containment. This ending saw Hornet sacrifice her freedom to extend the seal's duration, becoming both prisoner and guard in a combined solution that still merely delayed the inevitable. The ending where the ghost achieved the Void Heart and defeated the Radiance in her own realm offered true resolution. The god was destroyed, the infection ended permanently, and Hallownest's survivors could build whatever future they chose. Yet this came at the cost of the ghost itself, potentially all the vessels, and the permanent destruction of an ancient god violence on a cosmic scale, even if ultimately necessary. The God-Seeker ending presented the darkest possibility, the Radiance, released through the God-Seeker's obsession, consumed from within by the void, but threatening to spread beyond Hallownest's boundaries. The ghost contained both god and worshipper in void, preventing the infection from reaching new kingdoms, but also extending the conflict beyond Hallownest itself. Each ending asked different questions about sacrifice, permanence, and the nature of solutions. Was it better to accept a temporary fix that preserved what remained, or to seek permanent resolution regardless of cost? Could the ghost make such choices consciously, or did it simply follow the path before it? Did defeating the Radiance constitute justice, or merely the victory of one force over another? In the end, Hallownest fell quiet. The eternal rain in the City of Tears continued to fall, but it fell on streets cleansed of infection, on ruins that could decay naturally rather than being consumed by hostile light. The Mantis tribe maintained their territory, their honor intact, and their borders secure. Deepnest remained hostile and chaotic, but no worse than it had always been. Elderbug remained in Dirtmouth, the last resident of a surface town that had once served as Hallownest's gateway. Perhaps others would come now that the infection had ended. Perhaps Dirtmouth could grow again, or perhaps it would remain a village of one, a keeper of memory for a kingdom that existed now only in ruins and stories. The infrastructure of Hallownest, the stag stations, the trams, the elevators and passages stood as monuments to the civilization that had built them. Some still functioned, maintained by force of habit or enchantment. Others had failed, their mechanisms seized or broken beyond repair. The survivors carried forward what they remembered and what they chose to preserve. The Mantis tribe would teach their young the old forms of combat, maintaining traditions that predated the Pale King and would outlast his kingdom. Whatever bug survived in the City of Tears or other regions would tell stories of Hallownest's glory and fall, tales that would grow mythic with retelling. Hornet remained as protector and witness, the only child of the Pale King still active in the world. Whether she would rebuild anything, whether she would simply guard the ruins, whether she would leave Hallownest entirely, these questions remained unanswered, waiting for whatever story might follow. The kingdom's great question, whether the Pale King's gift of sapience had been worth its cost, could never be answered definitively. He had granted thought and meaning to creatures who had existed without either creating art, culture, civilization, and suffering where only instinct had been before. The bugs who benefited from his gift could create and choose and love. They could also fear and grieve and die in agony as the radiance consumed their minds. Perhaps the true legacy of Hallownest was simply that it had existed at all, a kingdom of impossible beauty built in the deep places of the earth, a civilization of awakened minds that had reached heights of achievement before falling to a god's vengeance and a king's failed solution. The ghost's journey had ended that fall, preventing it from consuming everything, allowing what remained to persist in peace. In the abyss, the void rested once more, having risen to destroy a god before settling back into primordial darkness. The countless vessels who had climbed toward their father's light now lay still, their purpose finally fulfilled or finally ended. The kingdom of Hallownest had become a tomb and a treasure, a warning and an achievement, a story that ended in silence but resonated with the memory of voices that had cried out, screamed, laughed, wept, and finally fallen still. After the ghost sacrifice ended the radiance and freed Hallownest from the infection's grip, Hornet stood alone as the kingdom's protector. She was the last active child of the Pale King, born from his arrangement with Hera the Beast, bearing the blood of both worm and weaver in her veins. The ruins of Hallownest lay quiet around her. Elderbug remained in Dirtmouth. The Mantis tribe held their territories, and scattered survivors began emerging from hiding. But Hornet herself felt the weight of an incomplete story. She was half-weaver, descended from a spider tribe that had possessed ancient knowledge of silk and sealing arts. The weavers of Deepnest had been secretive even before Hallownest's fall, and Hornet knew fragments of their history but not its source. The weavers had not originated in Hallownest. They had come from somewhere else, fleeing something or seeking something. The details had been lost or deliberately obscured. Hornet sensed that understanding her weaver heritage might be essential to truly protecting what remained of her father's kingdom and her mother's people. She did not know that far beyond Hallownest's borders, in a distant kingdom called Farloom, her ancestry had already marked her as significant. She did not know that forces there had been searching for weavers, drawn by an ancient hunger and a god's awakening rage. The ancient kingdom of Farloom. Long before the Pale King transformed from worm to monarch, Before Hallownest rose in the deep places, another kingdom had flourished in lands far distant. Farloom had been built not in caverns, but ascending a great height, a kingdom that climbed toward the sky rather than delving into darkness. Farloom's early history had been one of multiple tribes and kingdoms coexisting in uneasy balance. 4 distinct civilizations had carved out territories: the Shellwood denizens in their forested regions, the industrious bugs of what would become the Gilded City, the deep-dwelling creatures of the lower reaches, and various other factions. These groups had maintained their own identities, trading and occasionally warring, but fundamentally independent. Then Grandmother Silk arrived. She was a pale being, a higher entity similar in nature to the Pale King or the Radiance, a god-level creature with the power to elevate lesser bugs into sapience and bend entire kingdoms to her will. Grandmother Silk possessed dominion over Silk itself, able to create and manipulate it with divine precision. She was drawn to Farloom by the concentration of bug life there, by the instinctive worship that pale beings crave like sustenance. Grandmother Silk desired children, but could not produce them naturally. So she took simple spiders, mindless arthropods, driven only by instinct, and evolved them. She granted them intelligence, taught them science and magic, gave them the ability to weave silk infused with soul energy. These were the first weavers, and they became her ruling class, her priesthood, her beloved children created from her own power. The weavers established dominance over Farloom under Grandmother Silk's guidance. They built the citadel at the kingdom's peak, a gleaming structure that became the destination for pilgrimages. They created weavenists throughout the land outposts, where they conducted experiments and practiced their arts. The silk they wove could seal powers, bind souls, create barriers between reality and dream. They were masters of their craft, second only to their creator. For a time, Farloom thrived under this theocracy. The citadel shone, pilgrims ascended the kingdom's heights seeking enlightenment or favor, and Grandmother Silk ruled through her weaver children. The kingdom's symbol became the silk spool, its traditional weapon, the gilded pin rather than the nail. Song and silk defined Farloom's culture, beautiful and oppressive in equal measure. But the weavers, having been granted intelligence and will, eventually sought something their creator could not abide: freedom. The Weaver Rebellion. The specifics of what sparked the rebellion remained fragmentary, lost to time and deliberate erasure. Perhaps the weavers resented being eternal children under Grandmother Silk's control. Perhaps they discovered something about their own nature or their creators that horrified them. Perhaps they simply wanted to determine their own fates rather than exist as extensions of a god's will. Whatever the cause, the weavers turned against Grandmother Silk. Using the very silk weaving arts she had taught them, they created bindings powerful enough to trap a higher being. In a great ritual that required tremendous sacrifice, they sealed Grandmother Silk into a cocoon, imprisoning her in a state between death and sleep, held by bindings that should have lasted forever. With their creator bound, the weavers became Farloom's true rulers. They governed with knowledge and craft, maintaining the kingdom without the oppressive presence of divine will. Some weavers, seeking to ensure they would never again be vulnerable to a higher being's control, began emigrating to other lands. A significant population traveled to the distant kingdom of Hallownest, where they would eventually settle in Deepnest under the rule of Hera the Beast. The weavers, who remain in Farloom, tried to build something new, a kingdom where bugs could think and choose without a god watching over them. They created elaborate weavenists for their experiments, attempted to develop new forms of life through silk manipulation, and maintained the seals on Grandmother Silk with meticulous care. But they had made a critical error. They had bound Grandmother Silk, but they had not destroyed her. A god, even imprisoned, does not simply cease to exist. In her cocoon, Grandmother Silk slept and festered and slowly, inexorably began to wake. The weaver's descendants, generations removed from the rebellion, grew complacent. They began using Grandmother Silk's silk in their daily lives, incorporating it into their society without fully understanding the danger. The citizens of Farloom, particularly those in the prosperous Whitewood district, discovered that consuming or using the mother silk extended their lifespans, granted them vigor and health beyond normal limits. This casual use created a connection, a thread, however thin, between Grandmother Silk and the bugs of Farloom. Through these threads, still bound in her prison, but growing stronger with each passing year, the mother began to exert influence. The awakening was gradual. First came subtle changes in behavior, bugs acting slightly off, their personalities shifting in ways family members might not immediately recognize. Then came the visible signs. Silk threads appearing to control bugs like marionettes, corpses reanimating and walking through cities they had died in, eyes glazing over as individual wills dissolved into unified purpose. This was the haunting Farloom's equivalent to Hallownest's infection, but different in its mechanism. Where the radiance had invaded minds with aggressive light, Grandmother Silk infiltrated through her silk's physical presence. The threads wove through bugs' bodies into their nervous systems, creating puppet strings that let the mother control them, even from her prison. The weavers, recognizing the threat they had failed to permanently eliminate, attempted to fight back. They tried to strengthen the seals, to cut the connections between the haunted and their creator, to develop counters to the mother's growing influence. Some weavers even attempted to create artificial higher beings using pure silk beings like Eva, constructed entities that might have the power to challenge Grandmother Silk without being vulnerable to her control. But the mother's reach had grown too extensive. The bugs of Farloom, having incorporated her silk into their society, could not easily remove it. The threads ran through everything: buildings, clothing, food stores, water supplies. Removing the mother's influence would require destroying the very infrastructure of civilization. The haunting spread. More bugs fell under the mother's control. The haunted maintained a semblance of functionality. They could still perform tasks, still maintain society's basic operations, but they served only one will now. Grandmother Silk was rebuilding her kingdom from within her prison, reclaiming her children and their civilization thread by thread. Desperate to save themselves, the remaining free bugs of Farloom underwent a dramatic ideological shift. If the weavers had caused this catastrophe by rebelling against their god, then perhaps the solution was to embrace that god once more. A religious fervor swept through the uninfected population, particularly in the Citadel and its surrounding territories. The Bell Church rose to prominence, a faith dedicated to reawakening and worshiping Grandmother Silk completely, believing that if they gave themselves willingly to her, she might show mercy rather than forcing control upon them. Bell bearers became the church's missionaries and enforcers, their instruments both musical and martial. The Citadel transformed from a weaver administrative center into a religious capital focused entirely on serving the slowly awakening mother. This counter-revolution turned viciously against the weavers. Those who had once ruled Farloom were now deemed heretics, betrayers of the natural order, criminals who had dared imprison a god. The weavers were hunted, killed, imprisoned, or driven into exile. Their weavenists were destroyed or repurposed. Their knowledge was suppressed or corrupted into forms that served the Bell Church's narrative. The first weaver, the most powerful weaver remaining in Farloom, possibly one of the original rebels who had sealed Grandmother Silk, was captured and locked away in a secret prison near the Slab, a facility the weavers themselves had built for containing criminals. This imprisonment was particularly cruel, sealed away in darkness, forgotten deliberately so that future generations would not even know to search for her. The remaining weavers fled Farloom entirely. Some likely perished in the journey. Others may have reached distant kingdoms, bringing with them fragments of their silk-weaving knowledge and the trauma of their people's fall. Whether any of these later waves of refugees reached Hallownest, whether they reinforced the weaver population in Deep Nest, remained uncertain. What was certain, by the time Hallownest fell to the infection, Farloom had already become a kingdom of controlled bugs and religious fervor. With Grandmother Silk nearly fully awakened and searching for the one thing that could complete her resurrection, a weaver, alive and powerful, to serve as a focal point for her return. Hornet's weaver blood marked her like a beacon to those searching for such beings. The Bell Church's seekers had scoured distant lands for any remaining weavers, and they found her, the princess protector of Hallownest, daughter of the Pale King, and descended from Hera, who had herself descended from weaver lineage. They came for Hornet with careful preparation. The seekers used a specialized cage designed to drain strength and suppress abilities, ensuring she could not simply fight her way free. The capture itself likely occurred while Hornet was investigating matters beyond Hallownest's borders, perhaps seeking information about her weaver heritage, perhaps simply exploring the wider world after the ghost sacrifice had freed her from the duty of guarding a dying kingdom. The Seekers transported Hornet across vast distances toward Farloom, carrying her in the draining cage suspended from a bridge or platform high above the ground. They were careful, ritualistic in their handling of this precious cargo. Grandmother Silk had commanded them to bring a weaver, and they had found one who carried not only weaver blood but also the blood of a worm, a combination potentially more powerful than any pure weaver could have been. But fate, chance, or something else intervened. A glowing bug, whether by accident, intention, or drawn by forces beyond understanding, fluttered down and broke the seal on Hornet's cage. The binding released, Hornet's strength flooded back, and in the chaos that followed, the bridge collapsed. Hornet plummeted into the depths of Farloom, falling far from the Seeker's planned destination at the Citadel's heights. She crashed into the Moss Grotto, the lowest regions of the kingdom, far from where her captors had intended to deliver her. Injured, disoriented, and trapped in a completely unfamiliar kingdom, Hornet found herself at the very bottom of a land she did not understand, facing a climb toward mysteries she could not yet imagine. The Seekers had lost their prize. Grandmother Silk's awakening, which required a weaver's presence to complete, remained frustratingly unfinished. But Hornet was now in Farloom, and she would discover the truth of this kingdom whether she intended to or not. Hornet rose from the moss and water of the grotto with characteristic determination. She might not have chosen to come to Farloom, but she refused to remain helpless in its depths. The Citadel loomed somewhere far above the obvious source of the Seekers who had captured her, and therefore the place where she would find answers. The kingdom she found herself in was both beautiful and deeply wrong. Farloom's architecture blended organic and constructed elements in ways that felt simultaneously elegant and oppressive. Everywhere Hornet looked, she saw silk woven into walls, hanging in decorative patterns, forming bridges and barriers embedded in the very substance of the kingdom. And everywhere, she encountered the haunted. These were bugs controlled by Grandmother Silk's threads, visible as silk strands emanating from their bodies like puppet strings. The haunted attacked on sight, driven by the mother's will to eliminate threats, or perhaps to capture the weaver who had escaped the Seekers. They moved with eerie coordination, their individual personalities subsumed into collective purpose. But not all Farloom was haunted. Hornet discovered pockets of resistance bugs who had avoided or resisted the mother's influence through various means. In the Moss Grotto, she met the chapel maid, who provided her with initial guidance. As she climbed higher through Deep Docks and Bell, Heart, she encountered other survivors maintaining some semblance of free will. These survivors had organized themselves into small communities centered around wish walls, communal boards, where bugs could post requests for help, create quests for capable warriors like Hornet, or simply communicate with each other, despite the hauntings' isolation. The wish system represented Farloom's desperate attempt to maintain society despite the mother's influence, a way for free bugs to coordinate without physically gathering in ways that might attract haunted attention. Hornet took on these wishes, partly from necessity. Many rewards were tools or abilities she needed to progress, and partly from something deeper. She saw in Farloom's struggling survivors echoes of Hallownest's fall, bugs trying to maintain hope and community while forces beyond their control consumed their kingdom. Unlike in Hallownest, where she had ultimately been unable to save the kingdom from its fate, here she could make immediate, tangible differences in individual lives. The tools Hornet collected differed significantly from the charms the ghost had used. Instead of passive enhancements, Farloom's tools were active abilities divided by color and purpose. Red tools for offense, blue for defense, yellow for utility. She acquired traps, bombs, special movement techniques, and weapons that reflected Farloom's culture of active, aggressive survival rather than Hallownest's more contemplative approach. She also discovered her connection to music. The needle-in, a stringed instrument that could produce specific melodies, became essential for solving puzzles and progressing through certain areas. Bells throughout Farloom responded to sound, and Hornet learned that music and silk were the two fundamental forces shaping this kingdom, just as Void and Soul had shaped Hallownest. As Hornet climbed higher, she encountered boss after boss, powerful entities that served as either guardians of territory, haunted champions empowered by Grandmother Silk, or independent forces pursuing their own agendas. Each victory brought her closer to understanding Farloom's tragedy and her own role in it. In her ascent, Hornet crossed paths repeatedly with a mysterious warrior named Lace. Where Hornet wielded needle and thread, Lace fought with an ornate pin and silk ribbons, moving with grace that suggested both deadly skill and something more, a connection to silk that went beyond mere craft. Their first encounters were tests, Lace probing Hornet's capabilities without revealing her own motivations. She spoke in riddles and implications, clearly knowing far more about Farloom's situation than she shared. There was a sadness to Lace, a weight of knowledge that colored even her most aggressive attacks. Lace was Grandmother Silk's daughter, not created from lesser bugs like the Weavers had been, but born from the mother's own essence in a way that remained mysterious. Where the Weavers had been granted intelligence and then rebelled, Lace had been raised with awareness of her nature from the beginning. She loved her mother, but she also understood what her mother had become and what she intended. Grandmother Silk desired to fully awaken and reclaim Farloom completely, but she also wanted Lace to inherit a perfect kingdom, wanted her daughter to rule over a civilization unified under silk and song. This created an impossible tension in Lace's duty to her mother, love for her mother, but also awareness that her mother's vision meant the end of free will for every bug in Farloom. Lace tested Hornet because she was searching for an alternative. If Hornet proved strong enough, capable enough, perhaps she could accomplish what Lace could, not finding a way to stop Grandmother Silk without killing her, or at least making the ending meaningful rather than simply tragic. Hornet's journey brought her eventually to the Gilded City, Farloom's most prosperous region before the haunting spread. Here, the architecture reached its most elaborate, gold and silk combined in displays of wealth and power that would have impressed even the Pale King's court. But the haunting had devastated this place, particularly severely. The wealthy bugs who had consumed the most of Grandmother Silk's silk-enhanced products had been most vulnerable to her influence. Beyond the Gilded City rose the Citadel itself, the gleaming structure at Farloom's peak, where pilgrims had once sought enlightenment and where Grandmother Silk's presence was strongest. The Bell Church controlled the Citadel completely, maintaining their rituals and preparing for their goddess's full awakening. To reach the Citadel's highest point, Hornet needed to learn the threefold melody, 3 musical phrases that, when combined, could open the path to the cradle, the very summit where Grandmother Silk waited in her cocoon. Learning these melodies required Hornet to delve into Farloom's deepest secrets, to understand the interplay of silk and song that defined this kingdom. She discovered the truth about the Weavers' rebellion and fall. She found evidence of their desperate experiments trying to create counters to Grandmother Silk's power. She encountered survivors who remembered fragments of Farloom's history before the haunting, who could explain how a kingdom of independent bugs had transformed into a theocracy of controlled puppets. And she understood finally why she had been captured. Grandmother Silk needed a weaver to complete her awakening, to serve as a conduit or focal point that would let her fully manifest her power. Hornet's mixed heritage, weaver and worm, made her uniquely valuable. The mother intended to either bind Hornet as a vessel or perhaps absorb her bloodline entirely to gain access to worm power alongside her existing silk dominion. Hornet reached the cradle at last, ascending through the Citadel's heights to confront Grandmother Silk directly. The pale being waited in a massive cocoon of silk, partially awakened, powerful even in her incomplete state. She had been beautiful once, perhaps, in the way that gods are beautiful, perfect, and terrible and beyond mortal comprehension. The battle was fierce. Grandmother Silk fought with silk manipulations that filled the entire arena, creating blades and barriers and binding threads that sought to entangle Hornet. She demonstrated the overwhelming power that had let her dominate an entire kingdom, the divine strength that made pale beings the apex predators of their world. But Hornet had learned well. She used every tool and technique acquired during her ascent, dodging and striking with precision that matched Lace's own skill. She understood silk now, understood its properties and weaknesses, and she fought not just with strength, but with knowledge. When Grandmother Silk finally fell, wounded to the point of vulnerability, Hornet faced her first major choice. The simplest option was to bind Grandmother Silk's power to take the defeated god Silk into herself, becoming in essence the new ruler of Farloom. This would transform Hornet into a Weaver Queen, a being partway between bug and higher entity, with the power to control Silk throughout the kingdom. The haunting would end because Hornet would replace the mother as Silk's master, but Farloom would remain fundamentally a theocracy, just with a different god in charge. Some paths led to the Twisted Child ending if Hornet had become cursed through specific choices. Vines would burst from her when she defeated the mother, transforming both of them into something wooden and strange, a plant-based entity that suggested entirely different forces might claim Farloom in the power vacuum. But there was another option, available only if Hornet had completed the Silk and Soul quest, a complex series of wishes culminating in the caretaker of Songclave revealing himself as a snail shaman and offering to create a trap that could remove Grandmother Silk from power entirely. If Hornet chose to use the Soul Snare instead of binding Grandmother Silk, the caretaker's trap activated. It opened a portal directly to the void, the same primordial darkness that lay beneath Hallownest, the same force that had consumed the Radiance. The void was not unique to Hallownest. It existed as a fundamental layer of reality across many lands, always hungry, always waiting beneath the civilizations built by higher beings. Void tendrils burst from the portal, seizing Grandmother Silk and dragging her toward the abyss. But the mother, in desperation, grabbed Hornet, trying to pull the Weaver into darkness with her. If she would fall, she would take this key to a resurrection with her. Lace intervened at the last moment. She cut off her mother's arm and stabbed her with a pin, freeing Hornet but condemning herself. Lace fell into the void alongside Grandmother Silk. The portal closed and Hornet collapsed, barely escaping the same fate. But the danger had not ended. Grandmother Silk, trapped in the void but still possessing immense power, created a massive cocoon around herself and Lace to protect her daughter. Her silk threads, now soaked with void corruption, burst from the abyss and spread throughout Farloom like black veins. The haunting transformed into something worse. Bugs became afflicted not just by silk control, but by void corruption, their forms warping and changing, their attacks enhanced with primordial darkness. This began Act 3, and Farloom's state transformed dramatically. Bone Bottom, one of the kingdom's major settlements, was nearly destroyed by void silk eruptions. The stable communities Hornet had helped build during Act 1 faced new devastation. Void-corrupted enemies appeared throughout the kingdom, and survivors huddled in makeshift camps, terrified of the spreading darkness. Grandmother Silk's screams echoed through Farloom as the void slowly consumed her in the abyss depths. Each scream sent tremors through the kingdom, destabilizing structures and causing further chaos. She was dying, but she was dying slowly and taking Farloom with her. Hornet faced a new quest: descend into Farloom's abyss to save Lace and end Grandmother Silk's suffering before the entire kingdom collapsed. This required acquiring new abilities, completing even more difficult wishes, and ultimately obtaining the Diving Bell, a tool that would let her survive the void's depths long enough to reach the mother's cocoon. Farloom's abyss was similar to Hallownest's in its fundamental nature, a place where the void's presence was strongest, where darkness became tangible and hostile. But it was also different, shaped by Grandmother Silk's presence and by the particular history of this kingdom. Hornet dove deeper than any bug should survive, passing through layers of reality and darkness until she reached the cocoon where Grandmother Silk had sealed herself and Lace. The mother still lived, but barely most of her strength went toward maintaining the barrier that protected her daughter from complete void corruption. Inside the cocoon, Hornet found Lace transformed into Lost Lace, her body and mind overtaken by void, fighting with enhanced abilities but no longer truly herself. This battle was different from fighting Grandmother Silk. Hornet fought not to kill but to free, trying to drive the void from Lace's form without destroying the person underneath. The battle was brutal. Lost Lace moved with void-enhanced speed and power, attacking with combinations that pushed Hornet to her absolute limits. Void masses spawned around the arena, and Grandmother Silk's failing strength meant the cocoon itself began breaking apart, exposing both fighters to the abyss's full force. But Hornet prevailed. She struck enough blows to loosen the Void's grip on Lace, weakening the corruption without killing her friend. As Lost Lace fell defeated, Hornet caught her and turned to Grandmother Silk, asking the dying god for one final gift. The mother gave her last strength as silk, pure, uncorrupted silk that Hornet could use to create wings or sails with his silk soar ability. With this gift, Hornet tried to escape the abyss, carrying Lace toward the surface. But they could not make it alone. The Void sensed them, reaching out with tendrils to drag them back down, to claim these two as it had claimed the mother. Hornet and Lace fell, silk strength failing, the abyss opening beneath them like a hungry mouth. Then the night appeared. The little ghost from Hallownest, the vessel who had sacrificed itself to destroy the Radiance, had become something more in the Void. Whether this was the full manifestation of the Shade Lord, whether it represented the collective consciousness of all vessels, or whether the night had simply evolved into a void entity of immense power remained ambiguous. But it was recognizably the sibling Hornet had tested, fought alongside, and watched sacrifice itself. The night emerged from the void alongside countless smaller shades, perhaps the other vessels, perhaps manifestations of the void itself, taking forms it remembered. They formed a protective barrier around Hornet and Lace, shielding them from the void's hunger and carrying them upward. In this moment, Hornet understood something profound about her sibling's sacrifice. The night had not simply been destroyed by containing and eliminating the Radiance. It had become one with the void, had perhaps gained some measure of influence or consciousness within that primordial force. It could act, at least briefly, to protect those it had cared for. The Shades delivered Hornet and Lace safely to Farloom's surface, then faded back into darkness. The night gave its sibling one final gift, rescue and survival, before returning to whatever existence it maintained in the void depths. With Grandmother Silk dead, consumed entirely by the void she had tried to resist, her corrupted silk threads throughout Farloom dissolved. The haunting ended completely. Bugs who had been controlled by the mother's threads regained their wills, though many had suffered damage to their minds and memories. The void corruption receded, no longer sustained by the mother's failing attempts to resist it. Lace awakened from unconsciousness to find herself on Farloom's surface with Hornet. They shared a quiet moment, two warriors who had tested each other, fought on opposite sides, and ultimately worked together to free a kingdom from divine oppression. Farloom lay devastated but free. The citadel stood emptied of its Bell Church hierarchy, its purpose as a site of worship rendered obsolete. The Gilded City remained damaged, its wealth meaningless in the wake of so much loss. Bone Bottom required complete rebuilding. Countless bugs had died, either as haunted puppets or as victims of the void corruption in Act 3's chaos. But the survivors could think for themselves again. The wish walls could be repurposed from desperate survival coordination to actual community organization. The freed bugs could decide their own fates without a pale being determining their paths. Hornet remained as a protector, much as she had in Hallownest. But where Hallownest was a tomb to be guarded, Farloom was a damaged kingdom that could potentially rebuild. Her role shifted from solitary guardian to active participant in reconstruction. Someone with the strength to defend against external threats, and the knowledge to help avoid the mistakes that had led to Grandmother Silk's rise and fall. Lace provided a connection to Farloom's past, and an understanding of what the kingdom had been before the haunting. Together, they might create something new, neither a return to the Four Kingdoms era before Grandmother Silk, nor a continuation of the theocratic nightmare that had followed, but something genuinely different. For those who had tracked down Mr. Mushroom throughout Farloom, listening to his cryptic speeches in 7 different locations, a final revelation awaited. After the ending, Mr. Mushroom appeared one last time, speaking of cycles and ages before flying off into the sky beyond Farloom's heights. His final message suggested that the story was not over, that there were further implications to the defeat of two pale beings in two different kingdoms within what might be a relatively short time span. The screen displayed "to be continued," implying that the cycle of higher beings rising, dominating, and falling had not concluded with Grandmother Silk's death. The deeper question remained: why do higher beings exist at all? What drives bugs to give themselves to these gods, to crave the guidance and oppression that pale beings provide? Both the Pale King and Grandmother Silk had offered genuine gifts, intelligence, culture, extended life alongside their control. Both had been overthrown by the very beings they had elevated. Was there a way to break this cycle entirely? Could bugs maintain the sapience granted by higher beings without requiring new gods to sustain it? Or would another pale being inevitably arise to fill the vacuum, drawn by the same forces that had brought the worm to Hallownest and Grandmother Silk to Farloom? These questions hung unanswered as Farloom entered its uncertain future. Across two kingdoms now, higher beings had fallen. The radiance was destroyed, consumed by void. Grandmother Silk met the same fate. The Pale King had vanished or died. The cycle that had dominated these lands for generations had been broken in both places within perhaps a few years of each other. Whether this represented genuine liberation or merely set the stage for new tyrants remained to be seen. Hornet had witnessed both kingdoms' transformations. Hallownest falling from the Pale King's abandonment and the infection spread, then freed by the ghost's sacrifice. Farloom escaping Grandmother Silk's control through a combination of Hornet's intervention and the Void's hunger. The Void itself emerged as a constant factor. It had destroyed two separate pale beings in two different kingdoms. It responded to vessels created in Hallownest, but it also existed as a fundamental force beneath Farloom. The Knight could manifest within it and use it to rescue others. The Void was not simply mindless darkness. It had complexity, possibly even intention, though comprehending that intention from a mortal perspective might be impossible. Hornet carried knowledge no other living bug possessed. She had seen Hallownest's full cycle from the Pale King's glory through the Hollow Knight's failure to the ghost's sacrifice. She had experienced Farloom's liberation from Grandmother Silk's control. She understood higher beings intimately. Her father had been one, her enemy in Farloom had been another, and she carried both worm and weaver blood that connected her to these cosmic forces. If another higher being arose, whether in Farloom, Hallownest, or some other kingdom beyond both, Hornet would be among the few capable of recognizing the signs early and understanding what needed to be done to prevent the cycle from repeating. And also, Team Cherry announced that Hornet's adventures would continue in a new expansion called Sea of Sorrow, featuring her journey across and beneath salt-stricken seas. This suggested that Farloom's story was not entirely concluded, or that Hornet would venture beyond Farloom entirely into new territories. The nautical theme implied environments and challenges completely different from both Hallownest's caverns and Farloom's vertical ascent. Hornet might encounter new kingdoms, new societies of bugs, and potentially other higher beings or forces that shaped the world beyond the two kingdoms she had experienced. The sea represented uncharted territory in the Hollow Knight universe. Neither Hallownest nor Farloom had featured large bodies of water or maritime cultures. What bugs lived in or around the seas? What forces governed those realms? Had the Void's influence extended there, or did entirely different primordial powers hold sway? These questions awaited answers in whatever story Team Cherry would unfold next, building on the foundation they had established across two complete games and multiple DLC expansions. The complete legacy. The Chronicle of Hallownest and Farloom stood as a testament to the cost of divine ambition and the resilience of those who resisted it. From the Pale Worm's transformation and the granting of sapience, through the Radiance's vengeance and the infection's spread, to the Ghost's sacrifice and Hallownest's silent peace, and then across distant lands to Grandmother Silk's dominion, the Weaver's rebellion and fall, the Haunting's oppression, and Hornet's liberation of Farloom, the story revealed patterns. Higher beings rose, granted gifts that came with chains, ruled through combinations of genuine benefit and absolute control, and eventually fell when their subjects discovered that freedom mattered more than the benefits servitude provided. The Void served as a kind of cosmic recycling force. consuming gods who failed or were betrayed, returning their power to primordial darkness. Yet within this cycle, individual choices mattered. The ghost chose to challenge the Radiants rather than simply taking the Hollow Knight's place. Hornet chose to help Farloom's survivors, and ultimately to free Lace rather than simply binding Grandmother Silk's power for herself. These choices did not break the cosmic patterns entirely, but they shaped how those patterns manifested and determined who survived to tell the tale. The kingdom stood different now than they had been. Hallownest remained a tomb, but a peaceful one, its survivors able to rebuild something small and genuine rather than grand and oppressive. Farloom faced devastation, but with the freedom to determine its own reconstruction, no longer bent to a higher being's will. And Hornet, Princess Protector turned Liberator, carried forward the knowledge and scars of both kingdoms' trials, ready to face whatever challenges the wider world might present. The story was not over, merely paused, waiting for the next chapter to begin. And that was the full timeline of Hollow Knight leading into Silksong. If this video helped you understand the story better, make sure to leave a like. For more in-depth lore and timeline videos, don't forget to subscribe. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next story.